Alrighty, so we're going to wrap up chapter 23 and 24, looking at the American Civil Rights Movement. And one of the things to think about with the American Civil Rights Movement is where do you begin? And there's an article that was published by Jacqueline Dowd Hall, who's a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, in which she argues that the civil rights movement can be expanded to include everything from 1877 until the present time. It can also be shortened to where it's into a classic period where it starts with 1954 Brown versus Board of Education until the death of Dr. King. But I think at the heart of her argument is that really, depending on what you're looking for and the events that you're finding, you can really make the argument the movement can be as big or as small as you want it to be. So what are some of the activities that define the civil rights movement, and how do we define activism? We've talked a lot about African American rights really since the beginning of the course. And we have a number of people who are leaders within the African American community, and I've listed a few there on the slide. But one of the principal things that we're looking for the challenge to the white-dominated society. And I think when you start looking at challenges like that, you have to think about how do average people, average Americans, the average, kind of Joe Schmo on the street, how do they challenge society or something that they view as being wrong? And I think that's where you start looking into activism. Activism doesn't have to be challenging government or taking up arms. It can be as simple as refusing to give up your seat on a bus. It can be, drinking out of a fountain. If you're an African American and you're drinking out of a white fountain, that can be a form of activism when you look at the civil rights movement. But I think what is really important about, and what's really kind of impressive about the civil rights movement, is that what really begins to happen in the 1950s is a mobilization of activism really at the grassroots level. We have the large-scale movements, and of course you've got major leaders like Malcolm X and Dr. King who are leading these large movements, but these large movements are really nothing without the grassroots, everyday activism that a lot of people during the civil rights displayed. So looking at organizations and things that played a role, the fraternal organizations, and this is mostly in the early 1900s, play a big role because they provide mutual aid, they provide security for families. The Black Codes and segregation help to define segregation, but also mixed into segregation is the idea that it forces the Black community to look inward. African Americans were not allowed to go into certain places of town, and so they were able to create for themselves places where they felt safe. Black churches are very much in that kind of same vein. You have Black education, Black-owned businesses, Black newspapers, women's organizations never discount African American women as part of the civil rights movement because they certainly are, and major supporters of it, and activists as well. And then you've got organizations that also aid in the civil rights movement. So where most people start with the civil rights movement in what we call the classic period is in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. And this was a Supreme Court case. There were actually 5 class action lawsuits wrapped up into one, but the one that was chosen was the case of Linda Brown, who was trying to challenge segregation in Topeka, Kansas. And essentially, what it came down to, the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston decided that in the 40s and in the 50s, they were going to challenge the legal standing of segregation in schools, because to them that is because segregation was all about separate but equal. And so for them, the schools demonstrated, excuse me, the strongest discrepancy between separate but equal. African American schools pictured at the bottom left, like that one, compared to the white school to the right, it was obvious that there was a disparity between the two of them. And so they figured that if they could go through and challenge the school system, that they could get segregation, they could take down segregation. The other area where they began to work was in teacher pay inequalities. Teachers in the black schools were paid significantly less than teachers in white schools. And that went for men and women, no matter what your gender was, it was always that case. And so the courtroom now becomes kind of the battlefield for the civil rights movement. And this is something that continues to go forward through the entire civil rights movement. In 1954, the NAACP became the leading civil rights organization at the start of the movement. This will change because you have different organizations who take over that kind of the mantle of leadership. But it certainly launches the career of Thurgood Marshall, who argues before the Supreme Court. And he ends up becoming the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court later. But one of the things that comes out of Brown versus Board of Education is that they do rule that it is unconstitutional for segregation in schools. But one of the justices replies or adds a short phrase that schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed. And so what does with all deliberate speed mean? And certainly we're talking about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court ruling coming down. In some cases in the South, it is not until the 70s and the 80s that we actually have schools desegregated. So certainly the South takes its time in making any major changes. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who visits Money, Mississippi in August of 1955. He made the mistake of whistling at a white woman in a store. And in retaliation for that, there were a group of white men that he was staying with a cousin, that came to the cousin's house and asked to talk to him. And they took him away, and that was the last time anybody ever saw him alive. They find his body floating in a nearby river. And so when his mother was asked why she had an open casket service, she said there was just no way I could describe what was in that box. I wanted the world to see. And she said, I wanted the world to see what they had done to my son. There's a case that comes out in Mississippi, September 1955. It's an all-white jury, and of course the men are cleared of any charges. But the following year, in an interview in Look magazine, the men admitted to killing Till, and his casket is now on display in the Smithsonian Museum of African American History. 1955 launches the career of Dr. Martin Luther King. This is the bus boycott where Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat. And so you have an organized effort by people in Montgomery to avoid using the bus. And this isn't the first time we have a boycott or an organized boycott within the African American community, because we have this, if you remember, shortly after Plessy versus Ferguson, or right in that time period, there were several cases of in Jacksonville where boycotts against streetcars were launched, and they were very successful. In this case, Dr. King holds meetings every night at the church. The people come in and they are encouraged to continue with the boycott until the bus company does away with segregation. So we're not talking about streetcars, we're talking about public transportation buses. And so you have a massive amount of community involvement, people giving rides to the workmen or domestic help. The women were mostly domestic help. You have white women who are driving their maids to and from their house so that they will continue to come working at their house. And so it really becomes kind of a community-wide event that really redefines the civil rights movement. And of course, the Supreme Court ends up ruling that it's unconstitutional for segregation in public transportation. But again, here we have some repercussions. This, of course, jettisons Dr. King to the front of the civil rights movement, but it also creates, again, the precedent of courtrooms and what's happening outside on the pavement working together. So the community, while the courts are hearing the cases, the community is still participating in a boycott and supporting the people who are choosing to, rather than ride the public transportation buses, they're going to walk or ride with friends and that sort of thing. So there are four major organizations. We've already kind of talked about the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. It's formed in 1909. Major kind of agenda is to prevent lynchings. They really try hard to get a anti-lynching law passed through Congress, and it just never happens. But they start getting involved in the 40s and 50s in cases of teacher pay inequalities and school segregation. In 1942, you have the creation of the Congress of Racial Equality, which is CORE in Chicago, and their members, both men and women, both black and white. And they sought to use nonviolence as a weapon against segregation. And so this is heavily borrowing from the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi, who used nonviolence as a way to encourage people to challenge British rule in India. And so here in the United States, many of the civil rights organizations were using the same type of teachings. CORE organizes the Freedom Rides in 1961 throughout the South as a way to challenge segregation on buses. They launch freedom schools throughout Mississippi and teach the principles of nonviolence, but also teaching Black history. And they're focused around getting Black citizens to vote and to register to vote. And a lot of their money is coming from Northern philanthropies and donations. Dr. King forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957 after the Montgomery bus boycott. Ralph David Abernathy becomes his right-hand man, and that picture in the bottom right is Abernathy sitting next to Dr. King. It's a rather conservative organization in the fact that it's not challenging people to get out into the street and fight or use weapons. Again, it's all about nonviolence. And of course, the courtroom becomes their main battleground. In 1960, you have Ella Baker and Shaw University, who creates the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And this is a little bit more of a radical organization. It's formed about 6 years after Brown versus Board of Education, and it's mostly student-led. And they're geared towards voter registration drives and, again, Northern donations and fundraising in order to do all of these things. But they're a little bit more of a challenge to the white dominance of the South. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Actually, we'll talk about it right now. So Ella Baker pushes for a kind of collective leadership role within the organization. And this is rather than the Messiah type leader. She looked at Dr. King and she realizes that it's not about the one person, it's about the organization and sharing the responsibility. And so she criticizes the civil rights movement for its emphasis on black male leadership that was modeled more after the black church. And so her argument is that women can lead the civil rights movement as much as a man can, but it's also more about the grassroots effort than about a single person. And so we call this participatory democracy. This is a new movement that is permeating political activism. It ties democracy with grassroots participation. So there are three primary emphases for this movement: the appeal for grassroots involvement of people throughout society, the minimization of bureaucracy, and emphasis of expertise and professionalism as a basis for leadership. So getting rid of, having this huge structure to support the organization and rather have it more of a flattened organization. But your leaders should have the expertise and professionalism needed in order to be leaders. And the last one is a call for direct action as an answer to fear, isolation, and intellectual detachment. So direct action meaning we want you to turn out for this voting registration drive, or we want you to come down and participate in a boycott. This should be the center of the grassroots effort should be ready to mobilize at any time for any form of direct action. So the Southern Manifesto is in reaction to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. You have about 96 out of 106 Southern members of Congress denounce the ruling, calling it a clear abuse of judicial power. Southern states like Virginia completely closed their public schools and offered white students funds to go to private school. Black students received no such treatment at all. Like Prince Edward County closed all the public schools in 1959 and doesn't actually reopen them until 1964, when the Supreme Court pretty much made them do it. And so this is an example of the massive resistance that civil rights leaders face. This is a term used to describe actions advocated by Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia. And the primary goal was to prevent schools desegregation through creating new state laws and policies. So what you're having is the emphasis placed on states' rights versus federal. So many of these southern states were arguing that the federal government is overstepping its boundary by telling the state how to educate its children. Byrd said, if you can organize the southern states for massive resistance to this order, I think that in time the rest of the country will realize that racial integration is not going to be accepted in the South. Virginia passed what they called the Stanley Plan, which was a series of laws to prevent integration. So they forbade integrated schools from receiving state funds, and the governor could close any such school. The board, there was a pupil placement board. The board would determine which school a student would attend. And then they also used tuition grant structures that channeled money to students so they could attend private segregated schools of their choice. Okay. In 1957, the NAACP began registering students in cities and towns through the South following the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The officials at Little Rock School Board agreed to comply with the Supreme Court ruling. The board approved a plan submitted by its leader to gradually integrate the school system by 1955, beginning in the fall of with steps to integrate beginning in the fall of 1957. So they chose 9 students to integrate Little Rock High School. And the integration began on September 5th, 1957, with the National Guard there to, quote unquote, preserve the peace. However, what they do, the governor of Arkansas uses the National Guard to prevent the integration of the school, so to turn the students away. Eisenhower then nationalizes the Guard and orders the same National Guardsmen to integrate the high school and to guard the students as they walk to school. Now, all 9 of these students were picked specifically because of their grades and attendance. So these aren't, lackluster students. These are, very good students. But as you can see in the picture in the bottom left, this is a pretty popular picture. One of the students is walking, and these white students are following behind her, yelling at her. You can see the National Guardsmen kind of lining the walkway as well. But what this teaches the states is that when push comes to shove, the federal government is going to support the ruling rather than ignore it, which of course is what the executive branch and legislative branch should do. So when we take a look at Jacksonville, we've kind of talked a little bit about this. Segregation had its benefits and its obstacles. Certainly segregation as a practice it's not right. But what it does do is it fosters the community to take care of itself. You have a huge number of Black-owned businesses that are founded, Black organizations, that really, once segregation goes away, a lot of these businesses fold and they go out of business. Within the African American community, you typically had to have some sort of white connection in order to get access to credit. And so typically Black business owners would have white men that they were friendly with or in good terms with that would help them gain credit or mortgages or loans. The Negro Business League was one organization that was developed within Jacksonville and really in other places as well, which was to encourage local support for businesses. They would share best practices, or concerns, but it was kind of like a chamber of commerce for African American businesses. Jacksonville at one point had been called the Harlem of the South, and it had a very strong cultural background, great deal of music and art. You drive around La Villa today and you really don't get the gist of what all has been lost over the years. I mentioned before Abraham Lincoln Lewis when we were talking about Sugar Hill, but he's born in Madison, 1885, the first free child in his family. He marries the great-granddaughter of Zephaniah Kingsley, Mara Kingsley. He forms the Afro-American Life Insurance Association in Jacksonville in 1901, which makes him incredibly wealthy. And Eartha White serves as his clerk of the company. He lived in an affluent area for African Americans in Jacksonville called Sugar Hill. He was a good friend of Booker T. Washington and helped form the Negro Business League. Lewis also opened the Lincoln Golf and Country Club for African Americans because African Americans obviously could not go to any of the golf resorts or country clubs that were catering to the white community. But he also purchased a stretch of beach right around Amelia Island known as American Beach. And of course, beaches were segregated as well, so African Americans were not able to use just any beach. And so American Beach was one that he designated strictly for African Americans. Um, Lewis is also heavily involved in Florida Memorial College, which it changes names over time. It started out in Lake City, moves to Jacksonville in the early 1900s, and then in 1916 it moves down to St. Augustine. Um, and he's heavily endowed this university, this school, and it was a school for African American men and women to learn different trades. They changed the name to Florida Memorial upon the death of Abraham Lincoln Lewis, and the students actually built this arch that you see in these two pictures, and the arch is still in St. Augustine. It's out on County Road 214, which is King Street, and Holmes Boulevard. You can drive by and see it. And this arch was built in memory of Abraham Lincoln Lewis because he was a very favorite patron of the college throughout his life. Eartha White is born in 1876 in Jacksonville, the 13th child of a former slave. She ends up being adopted by Clara White. She graduates from Stanton School, moves to New York City, graduates from beauty school and the National Conservatory of Music. She returns to Florida and graduates from the Florida Baptist Academy, which is the Florida Memorial University, or what will become Florida Memorial University. But she does a number of things for the African American community. She starts the Clara White Mission, serving hot meals to the poor. There's Mercy Hospital for tuberculosis patients, the Boys Improvement Club, so that the boys will have something to do, constructive, and to teach them trades. Oakland Park was the first public park for African Americans. There's a halfway house for alcoholics in recovery. This woman did a lot, and she becomes kind of an iconic figure in the life of African American Jacksonville. Governors knew her, politicians knew her, and she could get her way. She knew exactly how to talk to some of these politicians to get what she wanted. And she was a real spirit and just an amazing figure. Harry T. Moore, and we talked about the cases for teacher inequality pay, or the cases about inequality pay for teachers. Moore started serving as the state secretary of the NAACP in the 1930s. And he began voter registration drives under the organization called the Progressive Voters League, starting in 1944, 1950. He and his wife worked as teachers in the school system, and because of their activism towards getting voters registered, they were both fired. But he launches a campaign to try and bring equality to the teacher pay between white and black teachers in Florida. And on Christmas Day in 1951, a bomb was placed under their house, and it detonated, and it killed both of them. And the blame for it, of course, is on mostly the KKK, but it's all about, the reason for it, of course, is their activism. But they're remembered as really the martyrs of the Florida Civil Rights Movement first. Jacksonville in 1960, you have these downtown images that show that downtown Jacksonville was a very lively city. But you have white flight into the suburbs. You have the interstate road system that begins to open up different parts of Jacksonville. And then you also have urban renewal. So the face of Jacksonville changes very quickly. We mentioned this before, the interstate construction system, or the interstate construction in La Villa and Sugar Hill. It takes out a number of these neighborhoods and really just kind of leaves them in ruin. The Greensboro sit-in, February 1st of 1960, they're students from a nearby black college called North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State College. who launch a sit-in at the Woolworths lunch counter. Um, Woolworths had a policy in the South that if you were African American and you wanted to order food, you had to place the order at the counter, um, and either they would bring it to you. You couldn't actually sit down at the counter and eat. Um, and so these students just come in and they sit down and they get harassed. And what happens is within days of the news of this sit-in getting plastered in the newspapers, you have other sit-ins that start taking place within the South and literally everywhere. It's like a huge, it spreads like wildfire. Jacksonville picks up this idea as well and does a number of sit-ins at the Woolworths counter, the Morrison's cafeteria, and all of these were right around Hemming Plaza. And so what they would do is they would go in, buy like a pack of gum or something, and then they would sit down. And the reason they would buy something is so that they could claim that they are a customer and not that they're just coming in and sitting down without buying something. And that's kind of a discreet way of trying to challenge the whole lunch counter policy. They had targeted stores for the lunch counters, but they also had demonstrations where African Americans were, like we mentioned before with Adam Clayton Powell in Harlem, where African Americans could shop, but they couldn't eat or get a job. And so they start picketing a number of these stores like Woolworths and boycotts and that sort of thing, where they can challenge the policy, the hiring policies. But there is a gentleman named Rodney Hurst who is still around, and this is him. He's like 14 years old, and he's the head of the youth council of the NAACP. And if you ever get a chance to hear him talk, I would encourage you to do it, because he's quite a character and just an amazing figure to listen to. And he'll usually talk about the civil rights movement in Jacksonville. But it spills over into other areas. Rodney and Rutledge Pearson, who was the gentleman in the Jet magazine front cover, he's a former baseball star who comes to Jacksonville and gets involved with the NAACP and helps them plan these sit-ins and demonstrations. But Rutledge Pearson and Rodney Hayes came down to St. Augustine and helped invigorate the St. Augustine civil rights movement as well. On August 27, 1960, there were a group of whites who go into, I believe there's a hardware store, or maybe it was Woolworths. They go into Woolworths and they buy a bunch of axe handles, because axe heads were usually very expensive, but the axe handles themselves were not very expensive. So typically, if you had a problem where you needed a new axe handle, you would just remove the axe head and stick the axe head on top of the axe handle. Anyway, we divert, going off topic. Anyway, so they knew that there were going to be some sit-in demonstrations, and so many of the KKK members and the White Council members launched what they called a counterattack on black protesters. And so they started pulling the protesters out of the restaurant, taking them out into the street and beating them up. And there's a map showing you where Hemming Plaza is, if you're familiar with it. And so this was where a lot of the activities were, because you've got the Morrison's cafeteria there, you've got the Woolworth store, and there was a May Cohen's department store, which is now City Hall. And so a lot of the activities around the sit-ins and demonstrations were taking place around Hemming Plaza. And so, of course, the police end up coming in and kind of breaking everything up. But it's, one of these things. There are very few reels of film about um, this incident. A lot of them have been destroyed. A lot of the photographs from the newspaper were destroyed, so that they couldn't name people who were involved, any of the white people who were involved. But WJCT did what am I trying to say? Documentary, thank you, about Accidental Saturday not too long ago, and they had uncovered some reels of film, and it's quite impressive to see that. In 1964, you have the bombing of the Godfrey House. The Godfrey family was trying to integrate Lackawanna Elementary School, and so the KKK placed a bomb near the house, and it blows up. Luckily, no one was killed, and there's a series of riots that break out as a result of that. An unfortunate incident was Johnny Mae Chapel, who was walking along the side of the road. Her car had broken down, and a group of white kids who had just been participating in the riots they drive along and find her, and somehow they end up hitting her or beating her up, and she ends up dying. And that's a picture of her husband standing over her corpse. And then in 1968, you have consolidation, and with consolidation, the kind of the selling point was that it would bring, by consolidating the city and county government, it would bring more opportunity for advancement for African Americans. And in fact, some of the first city council members are African Americans that were elected through consolidation. Some of the weaknesses identified through the 1964 riots, there's an absence of higher education. And so Jacksonville University comes along. It was still relatively new. FSCJ opens in 1966, and UNF opens in 1972. You have a fragmentation of business leadership in Jacksonville. The major players of the city failed to unite for important issues. So call it that they don't see the forest for the trees. They don't really understand the importance of the civil rights movement in Jacksonville, what have you. But the business leadership certainly was not supporting any efforts at equality. Consolidation would help attitudes to agree around citizens' views on politics and government, but the city's government had a number of scandals and kickback where politicians were charged with fraud, and that is one of the reasons why consolidation passes, is that they're hoping that consolidation will reduce the potential for that. Anyway, these are just some of the things that they're pointing to as weaknesses identified as to helping the 1964 riots take place. St. Augustine goes through a similar civil rights movement. You have Henry Hank Thomas, who actually is one of the Freedom Riders, but he comes to St. Augustine, and he and a friend have a bet that they are going to launch a sit-in at McCrory's lunch counter. McCrory's was a department store. The friend chickened out, but Hank ended up doing it, and he gets arrested, and they charge him with basically, they don't charge him with a crime. They basically send him for psychological evaluation, which, I mean, here's a lone African-American male, young man, launching a one-man sit-in. I don't know that I could blame them. But Sammy Davis Jr. hears about, he's an entertainer, he hears about Henry or Hank and pays his bail and gets him out of jail. So he ends up heading back north, but he certainly doesn't go away from the civil rights movement because, as I said, he's a freedom rider. Reverend Thomas Wright, who was a minister in St. Augustine at one of the African American churches, steps in as the advisor for the NAACP Youth Council. And so they launch sit-ins at Woolworths and again at McCrory's. And what happens is when they launch these sit-ins, the whites gather outside and basically are waiting for them to come out. And so the police come in and arrest pretty much all of the protesters, and there are quite a few of them. And so when they go before the judge says, listen, if your parents will sign an agreement that you will not participate in any more of these demonstrations, then you can go home and you won't have any charges pressed against you, but you do need to stay away from any of these demonstrations because we'll sign this form. All of the students except for 4, 2 boys and 2 girls, signed the petition or signed the form. And the girls are sent to a reform school in Ocala, and the boys are sent to a reform school in Marianna. And incidentally, the school in Marianna is the one that's been in the news, the Dozier School, where they have found a number of unmarked graves of African American boys who died at the school. It's been shut down for years, but now they're beginning to realize what all actually went on at this school. So I want to wrap up the civil rights movement by showing you a little bit of a regional difference. There was a survey in which Northern African Americans were asked what events they felt were more impactful, and then Southern African Americans were asked the same question. And they were given 4 choices: the murder of Emmett Till, Montgomery bus boycott, Selma, Alabama, and Birmingham, Alabama. And African Americans in the North largely felt that the murder of Emmett Till was the most impactful, largely because Emmett Till came from Chicago and ventured into the South, and they realized that this could very much happen to them if they step out of line from segregation. For Southerners, it was the Montgomery bus boycott because they could recognize the progress that was made by ending segregation on public transportation. So it kind of gives you an idea of the differences between the 2 different regions and why sometimes within the civil rights movement you have groups that don't always see eye to eye. But we'll talk more about African American movement in the 1960s.